So we've been all remote ourselves, so it's worked out pretty well for us.
Oh, good.
Normally I live in Chicago, but I got out of town in early March and
Haven't gone back?
back only about once a month just to get the mail, and that's about it, and a dentist appointment. So.
Yeah.
Welcome, Kevin, to technology.
No, I've moved up into the real world. It's hard to believe.
I know.
I broke down and got a new monitor.
A Stingy City village manager, huh?
I know, that guy's crazy.
Kevin, hi, good morning. This is Jim Perdykes from MCR. How are you?
Hey, good morning. It's got to be difficult. I heard you talk about the Chicago thing, smart on your part. One of my cousins, they're in New York City, and then his sister's, north in the Adirondacks area. And so he's like, Matt, see a city. And so he and his wife have spent time up with his sister, and they're very thankful they were able to do that.
Yeah, that's the truth. I'm in Sawyer, which is near, it's like, I don't know if you know where Union Pure or New Buffalo is.
No.
That would be exit 12 is Sawyer, so 84.
Yeah, Kevin, you remember where I got married?
Yeah.
I got married in Sawyer, so you should know that. No,
Exactly.
you were probably not even born then. So, okay, we're going to get going. It's 9:01. Keep in mind for the board, this only for the board is since we're doing remotely, you'll just need to announce your city and county and state. So, Tricia, would you call the roll, please?
Jeff Budd.
Here, Coldwater, Branch County, United States of America.
Kevin Cornish.
Kevin Cornish, Village of Clinton, Lenawee County, Michigan, United States.
It's going too far.
I know.
Dave Mackey.
City of Hillsdale, Hillsdale County, Michigan.
Chris Mathis.
Village of Union City, Branch County, State of Michigan.
Tom Tarkowitz.
I'm Tarkowitz, City of Marshall, Michigan, Calhoun County.
Okay. All present.
Okay, Tricia, I can help you with all the, there's 3 on from MCR and then the AMP staff who you know, so I can help you for the minute portion. So moving on, we need approval of the agenda with any additions.
If no one has any comment, Clinton will make a motion to approve the agenda.
Union City will support.
Okay, we have a motion support to approve the agenda without any additions. Tricia, we call the roll, please.
Member Budd.
Yes.
Member Cornish.
Yes.
Member Mackey.
Yes.
Member Mathis.
Yes.
Member Tarkowitz.
Yes, we have an agenda. Next on our agenda is public comment on agenda items. Pat, I guess, is there anybody there?
I don't see anyone on the call other than those folks you invited, so no public comment at this time.
All right, okay. Then we'll move on to approval of the minutes of the September 30th regular board meeting and the October 28th special meeting of the board. So I'll take a motion.
Clinton will make a motion to approve both of those minutes.
Hillsdale will second Clinton's motion.
Any changes? Not seeing any. Tricia will call the roll. Call the vote.
Member Cornish.
Yes.
Member Mackey.
Yes.
Member Mathis.
Yes.
Member Tarkowitz.
Yes.
Member Budd.
Yes.
Thank you, Tricia. Okay, Before MCR does their presentation, just wanted to share, this will be a little tag team here with Chris Mathis and myself. Union City and Marshall has been working over the last few months to assist Union City of something what their village would like to do. And so Chris, maybe you want to speak up on that?
Sure. We've been evaluating our position in the agency to see what is good for us, to see if it would make sense for us to exit the agency, as we're the one agency that probably has the most mobility here within the agency, as because we're not locked into the height roll. I'm not trying to rub that in with you guys, but since we're not locked in there, we do have some options. So one thing we did, we wanted to evaluate our position and see how much our value here in the agency is, and if we have more value than we do deficit in the agency. So I talked to Tom a little bit, as we figured they might be a good partner for this too as well, because they have needs in the transmission field. So we reached out to MCR to do a study to see what our valuation of our transmission rights are. We've had some brief meetings with them before this meeting, so we have some ideas of what they're going to present today. But for us, I think it looks pretty good. I think that we have a lot more assets in the agency than we do any deficit. So, and kind of that's what they're here to do, to talk about how much our transmission is valued at. I think this has a lot of importance to all of us here, since we all have some transmission rights within the agency. So I think this is pretty useful to all of us too, as well, to know how much our transmission is valued at, how much it's worth. Tom, did you have anything else to add to that, or?
Yeah, when I met with Chris, we looked at the assets and liabilities of what Union City has in the agency if they depart. And so I think we thoroughly discussed what we feel are those liabilities and assets. And so we'd like to, after the presentation, and then be asking to move forward to assist Union City from to leave the agency, and all the legal work that has to be done to do that. So I guess before we have MCR start, is there any questions from the board members about what has happened up to this point? Okay.
Tom,
Yes, sir. Yes, Kevin.
my only question is, this is, I know you can't go into closed session because it's not power supply, but is there any way that this can be done in closed session because you're trying to work through stuff, or is that just not possible?
I do not think it's possible. I don't think it meets the provisions of the Open Meeting Act. And both Chris and I feel that we wanted this sort of the first time this is made public, but we want to be very transparent to the board, to our communities, and to your communities. So so we don't think we need to, and we unless something comes up that the board feels should be able to be in closed session. So I think, Chris, we've talked enough that we are to the point where we're want to be very open to the public, the media, and about this proposal that Union City has. So
Okay. I wanted to raise
good question, Kevin. Okay. All right. I guess if we can move on to MCR, I'm not sure who's going to kick it off. If it's going to be Ron, it looks like. So, and Ron, why don't you introduce your team and then what you were engaged to do?
Sure, thanks, Tom. So my name's Ron Kennedy. I'm a director with Transmission Strategy Practice at MCR. Our vice president and lead of the practice area is Jim Pardikes. And then Chris Nagel is a manager. in the transmission strategy practice area at MCR as well. And he's going to be actually leading us through a series of slides through the analysis and talk about some of the conclusions that we've drawn. So I think it was at the end of June, beginning of July period, Tom and Chris asked us to kind of provide an independent evaluation of Union City's transmission rights or assets. And what we did is we gathered information from some of the financial information from Pam and Tom at AMP, and as well as the financials from Union City itself and the agency to understand all of the financial aspects of it. And then we spoke to the folks at Jennings Strauss, and we went through the operating agreement to understand the way that the agreement was drafted and what rights and obligations there are and what it would take for Union City to exit the agency and be able to get some value for these transmission rights, if you will. So you'll see that what we did is we looked at this thing, trying to get an evaluation of these transmission assets in three different ways. And we quickly, two of the ways were predominantly kind of a proxy to kind of try to find some valuation. You can see we quickly decided that or concluded that these two ways were really less relevant or not relevant at all for Union City. And we settled in on this third measurement of valuation. And Chris Nagel will go into that in more detail here in a minute. But in the end, through discussion with Jennings Strauss, we also identified some I guess, procedural or contractual steps that probably need to be taken to kind of proceed with this. But we'll have that open for discussion as well. Chris will detail those. So that being said, Jim, before I turn over to Chris, is there anything else that you wanted to add in here from MCR's part?
No, nothing else. Chris?
Okay. But without any further questions, I guess, for the group, we'll just move into the prepared slides. Chris, you want to take over?
Sure. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Can everybody see the initial page of this slide deck?
Yes.
Great. All right. So good morning, everyone. I'm Chris Nagel, as Ron just mentioned. Today, I'm gonna take us through a few sections of and sort of step us through the valuation approach that we took in valuing these entitlement rights. I'm going to give us a little bit of background on the entire situation at first, and just MSCPA and Union City and Marshall. Then we're going to talk a little bit about the objective and sort of why we wanted to value these entitlement rights. And that's going to cover a lot what Chris Mathis introed us with. And then we're going to shift over to how we approached valuing these entitlement rights. And that's going to lead us into a discussion about each of these three valuation methods that Ron just alluded to. Those three methods are, the first one would be the net book value, so the accounting value of the assets that underlie the entitlement rights as of 2019. And like Ron said, that's not a valuation method that we think is particularly relevant to the situation, but nevertheless, we are going to cover that. The second method is an idea of the incremental annual transmission revenue requirement that the underlying assets to the rights provide. Now, incremental annual transmission revenue requirement, what does that mean? These assets that underlie the rights, they have the ability to provide annual revenue to the owner of those assets. And this is particularly relevant to METC, but not to Union City and Marshall in this instance. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. And then this third method, we're really going to focus in on And that's how we believe that is what we believe to be the most relevant method to value these rights. And so we'll go in to our valuation itself and sort of explain everything that went into that valuation. Again, Ron also mentioned these considerations that the ownership and operating agreement sort of bring about for Union City and Marshall if this transfer were to take place. So we'll go over some of those considerations. Then we'll look at those three valuations together and compare and contrast and talk about, again, why we believe method 3 is the appropriate means of valuing the entitlement rights. And then we'll just go over the conclusions and what we believe to be the final value of the entitlement rights. And so I won't spend a terrible amount of time on the background here, but Michigan South Central owns about $8.47 million of gross transmission plant. Now, that gross transmission plant can't be partitioned, or it cannot provide this annual transmission revenue requirement to Michigan South Central. However, it does translate into about 121.5 megawatts of these entitlement rights. And these entitlement rights provide a lot of value to the members of MSCPA. In this sub-bulleted list here, these are 4 of the 5 MSCPA members that have a share of the entitlement rights. So the agency actually apportions its overall 121.5 megawatts across its members. Coldwater has 48.6, Hillsdale 30.98, Marshall 29.16, and then Union City has 4.86 megawatts of these entitlement rights. The 5th member, Clinton, actually takes service from DTE Energy, and therefore it doesn't really have any use for its share of the entitlement rights. It actually has 7.898 megawatts, but that 7.898 megawatts, because it cannot be used by Clinton, is apportioned, it's actually pro rata apportioned to the other 4 members. So the effective amount that each city receives is greater than the amount shown on this bulleted list. However, the 4.86 megawatts is what we want to focus in on for today's conversation, because that's really Union City's rightful share of that overall 121.5 megawatts. So the assets that underlie these entitlement rights, they are coming from the Project 1, which includes the 345 kV line from Palisades to Talmadge and the Campbell to Palisades Talmadge for 345 kV line. Now, Union City, as Chris Mathis explained earlier, is considering leaving the agency. However, the entitlement rights that are apportioned to Union City are really owned by the agency. And so it adds in further complications of what happens to these entitlement rights if Union City were to leave the agency. Marshall, on the other hand, is experiencing will be experiencing a large increase in load from its current level of around 25 megawatts to about 125 megawatts due to newly legalized marijuana growers. And the thought was between Union City and Marshall that Union City's share of the entitlement rights would be most useful to Marshall. And so that sort of gave birth to this entire engagement. Now, another key fact that will come into play later that I would just want to mention up front here is that in July, I believe, the agency members were able to buy, if you will, the unused entitlement capacity from other members at a rate of 75% of the Michigan joint zonal rate. So that's going to factor into our calculation later on, and we'll see exactly how that plays in. And with that, just to recap on the objectives here.
Can I interrupt for 1 second, Chris? Sure. This is Pam. I just want to clarify, you had a bullet in there saying that Union City has announced it is leaving the agency. I believe an accurate statement is that they're exploring options.
Correct. You're right. And we can revise that.
Thank you.
So just to recap on the objectives here, we wanted to determine the most appropriate or reasonable value of the Union City share of these MSCPA entitlement rights. And again, to do that, we looked at those three options: the net book value, the incremental ATRR of those underlying assets as it would be in METSI's possession, and the avoided costs for the holder of the entitlement rights. Now, because those avoided costs are most relevant to Marshall or to whomever or to whichever member holds those entitlement rights, this number 3 here is the most relevant valuation method. And with that, so when we approached this valuation, we worked with a number of parties. So AMP, Pam at AMP, and Tom at AMP in particular. They provided a lot of the asset gross plant depreciation values. They provided a lot of billing information as it came from MISO, and the O&M billing information from ITC. And then we also had some documents that helped us understand the allocation of the entitlements and the allocation of those costs amongst the various agency members. We also spoke with Jennings, Strauss, and Salmon, JSS, I'll refer to them as later on in this or throughout the presentation, to really understand that transmission ownership and operating agreement between METSI and the agency, as well as this wholesale distribution service agreement between Consumers Energy and the agency. There were a number of memos that we reviewed. We had calls with Jennings Strauss to understand those memos and sort of talk through these issues. And again, we'll cover those in the considerations of the TOOA later on in the presentation. We then used all these documents that we gathered from AMP and from Jennings Strauss to identify and quantify the transmission assets that underlie these these entitlement rights, the Project 1 assets. And this is just a list of those documents that we sort of cross-referenced and used to develop all the information that you'll see in today's presentation. So let's dive in a little bit to these 3 valuation methods and sort of understand why we came to this conclusion that the method 3, the avoided costs, is the most appropriate method for valuing these entitlements. This first method that we'll go through, this net book value, what it does is it provides the accounting value of the underlying transmission assets. So that's the gross plant values, so the original cost of those assets less the accumulated appreciation. This is really a proxy value to the portion of the entitlement rights, but it doesn't provide a very good valuation to the entitlement rights because it's valuing the underlying asset itself and not the value provided by those rights. The net book value is a common determination of value for asset sales. However, these typically, or this doesn't really have a close connection to the entitlement rights itself. And we'll see that it's not simply a calculation of just the net present or the net book value of the assets. There's also some multiples to take into consideration based on recent sales, and we'll go through that shortly. The incremental ATR, so method number 2, if a MISO transmission owner were to acquire the actual assets underlying the entitlement rights, it would be able to place those assets into its attachment O, the attachment O being the transmission formula rate that dictates the revenue requirement for each transmission owner in MISO. And these assets would generate an ATRR. So what we've done is we've looked at the incremental value of these assets in particular to determine this ATRR. Now, METSI has a right of first refusal to purchase these underlying assets should MSCPA sell or transfer the Union City allocation to a party outside of the agency. And that's key. Now, because what we're exploring today is this transfer between Union City and Marshall, this doesn't trigger that right of first refusal for METC to purchase the underlying asset. So this, in this situation, isn't relevant. The value of this incremental ATR can be calculated if we assume that METC is the asset acquirer, and we then place those assets into METC's attachment O and calculate the net present value of the annual stream of those ATRRs. The third method, so the method that we're really going to focus in on today, is the avoided costs. So these entitlement megawatts, they shield the holder from paying the Schedule 9 rate, the NITS rate in the Michigan Joint Zone. So this is a proxy that provides a evaluation of the entitlement rights as it is determined from the shield that it provides the holder from the Schedule 9 rate in that Michigan Joint Zone. Remember that Union City's apportioned share is 4.86 megawatts. So that's really what we're valuing here when we talk about the avoided costs, when we show our charts later on that show the annual and total net present value of these entitlement rights. We're really focused in on that 4.86 megawatts. And the net present value of the annual avoided costs really, just to summarize, provide this expected value of holding these entitlement rights for any agency member who has enough load to use them. So once again, just to really hammer this home, the net book value is not relevant to Union City and Marshall. The true asset that we're seeking to value today is Union City's share of the entitlement rights, not the value of the underlying assets. The net present value of the incremental ATRR is less relevant to Union City as well, because it's the value that is produced if METC were to hold the underlying assets and be able to include those assets in its attachment O. So if Union City or if the agency were seeking to sell these assets to METC, this would be a very relevant method of valuation. However, this is not the case in this engagement. So again, we are saying that this is less relevant to Union City and Marshall. And then finally, the net present value of avoided costs. This is the most relevant to Union City and Marshall, again, because we are really valuing the actual entitlement rights here instead of the underlying assets. And that's where that's the key to this method. We are measuring the value produced by these entitlement rights, and therefore the avoided costs are projected over the next 30 years. Now, the 30-year period is the estimated life, or remaining life, I should say, of the underlying assets. And that's why we chose a 30-year period. We're also going to quantify a 15-year view of this, just to give everyone an idea of what this net present value looks like over a 15-year period versus the 30-year period. So with that, we're going to look at the first valuation method, that is the net book value of the underlying assets. So as of fiscal year 2020, the net book value of the underlying assets, Union City's share, I should say, is $61,889. So you can see the gross plant and accumulated appreciation listed there. And the 61,889 represents a 4% share of that total underlying assets. Now, sales of assets, as I mentioned before, based on the net book value, are often made at a multiple of the net book value. So what we did is we researched a number of recent transactions that are at least somewhat similar to the situation that we have today. And you can see 3 FERC dockets listed here, and the corresponding multiple of net book value that the assets concern or within those FERC dockets were sold at. So the first one, that METSI Coldwater Board of Public Utilities, that was sold at straight book value, a 1x net book value. So no multiple right there. The Consumers METSI docket, that second one, actually was sold at a 1.8 times net book value. And then a ComEd and New Rochelle docket actually produced an even higher multiple of net book value. And that ranged between 2 and 3.25 times the net book value, depending on how you look at it. Now, I won't get into too many details on that last transaction right there, but there were a number of concessions made by ComEd where if you count those concessions, the financial value of those concessions in the actual valuation of the the assets that were sold, it pushes it from that 2.0 stated valuation up closer to that 3.25 times net book value. So if we apply this range of 1.0 times all the way up to 3.25 times net book value to that almost $62,000 net book value of the Union City assets, we come to a range of about $61,889 to about $201,000 for the underlying assets. Now, these are some relevant transactions or recent relevant transactions that have occurred. However, it doesn't mean that there wouldn't be another company willing to pay more or less than this range. So one or another company could value these assets at a greater multiple than this 3.25 times net book value. If it, for example, offered a beachhead. So if it offered it a way for it to get its foot in the door, if you will, into Michigan and more importantly into MISO, these assets might provide more value to a different buyer. So before we leave the net book value valuation method, any questions so far?
Hey, Chris, where did you, the 4.3%, where did that come from?
So the 4.28, actually, I believe this needs to be revised down to 4%. That was a share that Union City had if you included the redistributed Clinton entitlement rights. So that 4.28 is actually 4%.
Okay. Thanks.
Yep.
Chris, this is Kevin from Clinton. When you look at the gross at 79 minus the depreciation, so you're basically 62, would that be like the annual cost then times 30 years equals 1.8? Is that how that would work?
So that's actually a static view as of the end or as of fiscal year 2020. I'm sorry? Well, that accumulated depreciation number, as time goes on, the accumulated depreciation number is going to grow.
Mm.
The depreciation expense each year is going to accrue, and that $62,000 of net book value is actually going to decrease. So,
gotcha. I get it. My thinking was too simplistic. I understand what you're saying.
okay. All right, so we're going to move on to the second valuation method, which is the incremental ATRR as it would be to METSI if we were to place these underlying assets into METSI's attachment now. So a little bit of background about how we calculated this incremental ATRR. We had to forecast METSI's attachments O, which recovers Schedule 9 costs, and then GG and MM. Now, GG and MM are different formula rates that exist to calculate the revenue requirement that transmission owners get from cost-shared projects. Now, the assets that we're talking about are not cost-shared projects. They don't generate any value in GG or MM. However, the way that the attachments work, these formulates work, is that there's some interplay between the various revenue requirements. And so we had to calculate this 30-year forecast of each of these so that we could understand the impact that the assets, even though they're only included in the attachment O, have on the GG and MM revenue. Because if METSI were to purchase these assets and if the two parties were coming to the table, METSI would certainly be looking at how this impacts its GG and MM revenue. Now, that being said, what we forecasted these three attachments, the O, GG, and MM for 30 years, and we did it twice. We presented a base case scenario, which is where we assumed that METSI is just going to continue operating on exactly as it operates now. So no incremental addition of the Union City assets. And then we added in the assets to determine the difference between those two forecasts. And that the difference between those two forecasts is the quantification of this incremental ATRR. Now, other than the inclusion of the net plant and depreciation expense, all assumptions between the two forecasts are exactly the same. And the reason we do that is because we want to isolate the value of these Union City assets for the value that they would provide METSI if it were able to include these assets in its attachment O. Now, the base and change case forecast, and we'll go over the assumptions that we used shortly here. Even though the entitlement right or entitlement related assets are only calculated or captured in the attachment O, like I said before, they have residual impacts on the GG and MM. So you're going to see some assumptions for the GG and MM as well. And then to come up with these assumptions, we use publicly available data. So METSI each year, for example, provides a publicly available forecast of the next 4 years for its revenue requirement. So we went into that forecast, we sort of drilled down into it and used METSI's assumptions because they, of course, have the best view into their business situation. And then we used those as well as other publicly available data to project the remaining years in the 30-year period to finish off these forecasts, if you will. And some of those other sources included the 2020 MTEP. So MTEP being the MISO transmission expansion plan, which lists all the projected projects that would be going into service by transmission owner and other in attachment O data going forth in the 30-year period. So this table really just shows us various key assumptions that went into this METSI ATRR forecast. You can see that we're increasing the 12 CP load by just 0.4% a year, and we pulled that from the METSI forecast. Now, load matters because it is what's used in the calculation of the actual rate. And remember, we are concerned here with the rate and the overall level of ATRR. However, the rate does come into play later. For transmission plants, METSI has been investing quite a bit. And so we had $6.5 billion over the 30 years. Now this actually translates into a 4.5% annual increase for gross transmission plant through 2050, compared to an 8.7% annual increase over the past 5 years. Now that we looked at the numbers and we projected a slowdown here because of which is typically seen amongst these large transmission owners, just due to saturation and some very large outlier numbers that took place over the past few years from METSI's investments. General and intangible plant, we increased by $135 million over 30 years. Transmission O&M and including A&G increased by just over $66 million over 30 years. Depreciation and amortization expense, also a large component of the rate, increased by about $117 million over the forecast period. And then other taxes and capital structure didn't have quite as much of an impact. Other taxes at about 110 million over 30 years. And then the capital structure, in ROE in particular, we didn't change. So I will explain that a little bit. The capital structure in ROE, the return on equity, that is used to calculate the rate of return on rate base. So we talk about these transmission plant additions over the 30-year period, these general plant additions over the 30-year period. All that forms the rate base for transmission owners. And then this rate of return is applied to that rate base amount to come up with the return that each transmission owner gets to factor into its rate. Now, we held this constant because in looking at the last few years of METC's attachment O, it appears as though they are managing their capital structure at 40% debt and 60% equity. And so therefore we thought it's very likely that METC will continue to hold this targeted capital structure for the foreseeable future.
Yeah, this is Jim. Just to clarify that, they actually were approved at that capital structure by FERC, so it's unlikely. That's a very advantageous capital structure in MISO, so it's highly unlikely they'd want to change, even risk changing it by going in for another filing. So that is pretty well fixed. It's been the same since I entered MISO.
Right. So the initial ATRR benefits to METC start at about $7,600 per year. Now you'll notice in the chart here, this is the nominal ATRR, incremental ATRR of the underlying assets for the entire 30-year period. Now nominal meaning that these are not in 2020 dollars, these are in actual dollars for each of the years. And you'll notice that the annual benefit is declining over time. Now that is driven particularly by this depreciation of the assets over time. Remember, these about $62,000 of assets, they're going to continue to be more and more depreciated over time. And while METC could or will, in this situation, recover the depreciation expense with it, that also means that the rate base associated with those assets in particular is shrinking over time. And when the rate base shrinks, as we just discussed, that return amount is also going to shrink. And so that's causing this downward slope of the nominal annual ATR or annual revenue requirement. And that's and so this provides this first look of what these assets mean to METC. Now, more importantly, is the cumulative value that METC would get from these assets over the forecast period. So this curve is representative of that cumulative present value of incremental ATR. So we not only took the present value of each of those annual streams we just saw, we added it to the prior year as if METC were to bank the value created by these assets. And what we found is that as of today, those annual benefits total about $76,000 in net present value. And so this $76,000, the $76,293, this is what these assets would be worth to METC today if Union City and METC were to come to the table and agree to sell these assets to METC. So that being said, again, I just want to reiterate that this is not the valuation method that is most relevant to Union City, Marshall, and the rest of the agency. This is simply if METC were to hold these assets. Any question on the incremental ATRR calculation before we move on to the avoided costs?
Yeah, this is Jim again. This just highlights the fact that the asset itself, the value, it's not a situation where you ever want to be in a position where you had to sell these things based on a right of first refusal to MESI, because the value you'd get is peanuts compared to, what we're going to show you here in a minute, which is the value based on the entitlement itself and the avoided rates that would have to, that can be avoided based on holding these rights. So you never want to be in a position where you forfeit the right to give any asset, any of the entitlement to a member of Michigan South Central, because if nobody within the agency took them, then they would be available, if you will, to METSI at these. This is a unreasonably low value, if you will.
Right. And so as Jim just mentioned, the avoided cost method is going to prove that the entitlement rights really provide a whole lot of value to the agency and its members. Now, the entitlement megawatts, again, as we mentioned early on, shield the agency or whichever member to which those rights are apportioned from paying the Schedule 9 rates in the Michigan Joint Zone. So when we talk about avoided costs here, we're really talking about the quantification of these Schedule 9 costs for that 4.86 megawatts of the entitlement load. And what we did is we, again, forecasted the avoided costs over that 30-year period, again, 30-year period being the expected remaining life of the assets. What they really represent are savings for the holder of these megawatts. Now, the Michigan Joint Zone recovers NITS costs from METSI and cooperative energy. So CE meaning cooperative energy in this case.
Chris, you meant consumers energy. Sorry.
Excuse me. Yeah. Yes, consumers energy. Thank you, Jim.
Yeah, sure.
So each of these transmission owners, that being METSI and consumers, files an attachment O, as we mentioned before, to recover the Schedule 9 costs within the zone. That combined, or those combined costs, the combined annual transmission revenue requirement, divided by that 12 CP load that we discussed before, is the zonal Schedule 9 rate. And that zonal Schedule 9 rate is the foundation of what the avoided costs calculation is.
And let me just highlight one thing, Chris, if you can go back to that page. This is only a value if somebody has a need for these entitlement rights, right? If, for example, nobody in the agency needed these entitlement rights based on their load projections, then this may not be relevant at all. But in this case, it is relevant to Marshall in particular, because we know that Marshall will need transmission. So in the absence of getting these entitlement rights of 4.86, they would have to go and essentially buy transmission from MISO at the Michigan Joint Zone rate. So that's where we get this avoided cost idea. So if you need the transmission, you would have to get it anyway, and you have to be paying a certain rate to do it.
Right. Thanks, Jim. Yeah, and I think that's really important to recognize is we've spent a whole lot of time telling you about why the net book value and the incremental ATRR are not relevant. It's important to realize that they are not relevant in this situation. They are generally relevant metrics for the sale of transmission assets or just the general valuation of transmission assets, just not in this case. So how did we forecast this Michigan Joint Zone rate over the 30-year period? We performed a regression analysis on that consumer energy historical attachment O's. And that regression analysis looked at the relationship between the gross transmission plant in each year and the ATR, or the net ATRR in each year. And we were able to use that to project the consumer's attached or annual transmission revenue requirement over that 30-year period. Now, recall that we also had the METC attachment note already forecasted from our last or from our incremental ATRR method, and the combined ATRR for those two is the Michigan Joint Zonal ATRR. Now, over this 30-year forecast period, the zonal rate starts at 3.39 cents per kW month in 2020, and then it reaches a rate of $10.20 per kW month in 2050. That actually translates into a compound annual growth rate of 3.7% per year. And so this 3.39 to 10.20 rate, those are the costs avoided per kW through holding the entitlement rights. So the nominal value of these avoided costs is actually increasing over the 30-year period. You recall that in the incremental ATRR valuation method, we saw declining benefits over the 30-year period. These avoided costs are actually increasing. So over time, what this shows us is that the value of these entitlement rights are increasing. And the reason for that is because the Michigan Joint Zonal ATRR and rate is going to increase over these 30-year period. Now, those entitlement rights, that 4.86 megawatts, that doesn't change. So if you hold them now, you're going to hold them in 30 years. And so it's easy to see that the calculation there of the avoided cost is going to increase quite a bit over the 30-year period. And if we take the more relevant look, so step away from the nominal annual value of those entitlement rights and start accumulating them to calculate this cumulative present value, we see that we get a net present value of 10.4 million. And again, this is why Jim was saying that the incremental ATRR and the net book value methods are peanuts compared to what the entitlement rights are actually worth to the agency and to the member to which they're apportioned. Now, that 10.4 million is over 30 years. If we look at it from a 15-year perspective, we get $5 million. So even at 15 years, so half the period of the incremental ATRR, we have substantially more in value for these entitlement rights than is shown or than METC would have by holding on to the underlying assets.
And this implicitly assumes, right, that the agency continues on, right? If the agency for some reason decided to disband after 10 years, then these numbers would be based on 10 years. But this presumes that these continue on, and we did it for a 30-year period, as well as a 15-year period, just to give you some perspective on that.
Absolutely. So we're going to step away for a moment from the actual calculations of the value and then talk about this ownership and operation agreement and sort of the considerations that this transfer between Union City and Marshall or another member bring to the table. So the 121.5 megawatts, as we mentioned before, are held by the agency. So they're actually owned by the agency, even though the actual entitlement is apportioned and benefits the individual members. So you can already start to see sort of one of the wrinkles that this causes. If Union City is trying to transfer to another member, the actual ownership of these entitlement rights is held at the agency level. And so it's going to require agreement across the members. In the absence of another agreement, Union City or any member for that matter, leaving the agency, the allocated share is actually going to be recast, if you will, across the remaining members. And so directly transferring or assigning the Union City share of the entitlement rights is going to require a new agreement. And that new agreement, again, because it's at the agency level, requires it's an agreement across all members. And this agreement would ensure that the direct assignment of the Union City share was made available to Marshall. Now, this agreement is internal to the agency and doesn't require any regulatory approval or any buy-in from METC. And remember, it does not trigger that right of first refusal that METC holds if the agency were to sell the entitlement rights or the the entitlement rights to a third party that is not a member. So we also looked beyond just the entitlement rights here, and we looked at this 3.6 megawatts of wholesale distribution service that Union City receives from consumers. Now, as part of the 2016 settlement, for those unaware, Consumers provides 3.6 megawatts of this wholesale distribution service to the agency for use by Union City. Now, if Union City were to leave the agency, in our discussions with JSS, that does not trigger the termination of the TOOA, and therefore doesn't mean that consumers can just stop providing that 3.6 megawatts of WDS service. However, consumer could take the Union City withdrawal from the agency as an opportunity to cancel the provision because it's Union City that benefits from these 3.6 megawatts. Now, in order to deal with that, JSS proposed an option that would make it more difficult for consumers to really challenge the validity of this TOOA. And that is to develop a contract between Union City and the agency, even after its departure, if it were to depart the agency, for a continuation of the provision of these WDS megawatts. Any questions there before we continue?
Yeah, just to make sure everyone follows us again, these are separate and distinct from the 4.86 that we're referring to before. This handles distribution service. The other ones handle transmission service.
Right. So we stepped aside to discuss those considerations a bit, but jumping back to these valuation methods, this is really just a summary of the valuations that we arrived at under each of the valuation methods. So again, net book value, we had that range there because of the multiples coming into play. And really this could be higher than this with the right buyer. However, we just didn't feel that it is particularly relevant to the situation. So that really provided a bottom of the range here at about $62,000. The incremental ATRR approach was really only relevant to METC. If METC were able to include the underlying assets into its attached Renault, it would produce about $76,000 on a net present value basis of value over that 30-year period. And again, just some key takeaways from this. That annual value was declining over the years because the asset was depreciating. And it's only applicable if METC were to trigger its right of first refusal or take advantage of its right of first refusal, I should say. And again, because the transfer that we're discussing between Union City and Marshall or other members of the agency, that does not trigger that right of first refusal.
Yeah, and one thing I want to point out, the net book value in itself is Also, not relevant in the sense that any chance that Metsi would, if offered, not take you up on a deal where if they were, if they had a right of first refusal, they're going to take it, right? Because they want to keep everybody out of this area. They would not want a third party coming in buying any kind of beachhead into Michigan whatsoever. So it's the point here is that we're saying that the only way the net book value method would ever be operationalized in this sense is if Metsi declined a ROFR the right of first refusal to buy it, and the agency decided to sell the assets instead of internally transfer the assets.
Thank you. So the final method here, and the most relevant, the one that we're going to focus on for the remainder of today's discussion, is that net present value of avoided costs. Now, we arrived at about $10.4 million over that 30-year period on a net present value basis. And that $10.4 million represents the NITs, or the Schedule 9 charges, that are avoided. So basically savings to the holder of those entitlement rights if 100% of that entitlement capacity is used. So if all 4.86 megawatts are used every billing period to shield the holder from those costs, that 10.4 million is what the value provided over that 30-year period. And just another thing to keep in mind is that this number is so much greater than the other two methods because it's increasing in value as the zonal rate increases, and it's really shielding the holder from a lot more costs than would be provided to somebody that was able to include those assets in its attachment note, and that somebody being Metsi, of course.
And just to remember, Chris, flip back if you would to the graphic that where we got that 10.4 million, just to refresh people's memory. Okay.
So this is a good visual.
Yeah. All right.
Okay. So, and I know that we've been repeating this a lot, but it's really the key takeaway from today. The value of this entitlement rights is based on the avoided costs because it is really the only relevant method, or the only relevant valuation of these to a agency member. Now, the transfer of entitlement rights produces, or excuse me, the entitlement rights themselves over the 30-year period suggests a full value of 10.4 million over 30 years. It drops to 5 million over 15 years. Again, the other two valuation approaches, not relevant in this case. They're focused on the underlying assets instead of the entitlement rights themselves. Now, a transfer, once again, of the entitlement rights directly to Marshall is going to require an additional agreement amongst the agency and its members that really designates these entitlement rights to Marshall or any specific member. Otherwise, these entitlement rights are recast amongst all the members and everybody gets a portion. The projected value of the full portion of the entitlement rights is just a starting point for discussions between the agency and Union City, Marshall, and the other members. There's other factors to consider, and those are specifically the agency board agreeing to directly assign Union City's share to a single member after Union City's departure. Marshall stands to receive 1.3 megawatts of this share if no agreement is reached and the Union City share is just redistributed amongst remaining members. So that's going to really reduce this 10.4 million valuation, and we'll see shortly how that factors in. As Jim raised before, the longevity of the agency and the ownership and operating agreement between Metsi and the agency is really going to impact how we value the entitlement rights. So if the agency dissolves or in 10 or 15 years, you're going to have to adjust the forecast period because that value or the savings provided by the entitlement rights is no longer going to exist after that dissolve date. So again, this factors in 30 years or 15 years if you look at the alternate quantification, but would have to be adjusted if something along those lines were to be considered. And the final point that's also going to come into play here in a moment is that members are able to purchase unused capacity that's assigned or unused entitlement rights that are assigned to other members at a rate of 75% of the Michigan joint zonal rate. And so that sort of factors in because that's an opportunity cost. And before I jump into that specifically, we're going to go over this equation that you see on the screen. And I'm going to break it down by parts. So all the way to the left, you're going to see this 3.557 megawatts over 4.86. Now that 4.86, as you recall, is the Union City share of entitlement. However, that 3.557 represents the Union City share less the portion that Marshall would receive in a redistribution. So again, if the agency did nothing, it came up with no additional agreement that established the entitlement share would go directly to a specific member, each of the remaining members would receive a portion. And in this case, Marshall would receive 1.3 megawatts. So what we're doing with this left side of the equation here is we're really just taking the proportion that's left on the table after that redistribution consideration and factoring it into the valuation.
Let me just point out one other thing here. There's another scenario where the agency approves the intra-transfer of the Union City megawatts, but there's no buyers, right? No member decides to buy because they don't need it or just decline to do a deal. So that's the other reason why we subtract out that 1.3 is that Union City's in a position in here, even if the agency were to allow them to directly transfer, it's up to the other members to decide they're going to do so. Okay, so that's again the rationale for subtracting that 1.3.
Right, thank you. Excuse me, thank you. That is important. So the 10.4 you see here in the middle of the equation, of course, that's the 30-year avoided costs that we just came up with. So the total value. So we've just taken and proportioned that we've captured the portion of that 10.4 million that is truly left on the table for Marshall were it not to get a direct assignment of the full 4.96 megawatts. And then the final part of this equation, that's 75%. This represents that intra-agency compensation rate that we discussed. And this is important because in the absence of a direct assignment, Marshall is still able to procure or to buy this unused capacity at 75% the Michigan joint zonal rate. So we not only are we taking the proportion of that 10.4 million that's left on the table, if you will, we're also hitting it with the 75% because that represents what Marshall could purchase the entitlement rights unused by the other members. And
this is Kevin from Clinton. Is it possible to ask a question?
Sure.
You're looking at 10.4 million times 75%. Wouldn't that be closer to 7.5 million, not 5.7? I'm missing something.
Yes. So remember this left side of the equation, that 3.557 over 4.86, that's reduced even further. So it's not just the 10.4 million times the 75%.
Okay, I didn't do the times in there. Gotcha. Okay, I get
That's
it.
a,
Thank you.
that's just essentially another ratio times the 10.4 million times the 75%.
Yeah, because
Yeah.
the first calculations are going to reduce it, and then times the 10, and then times the. Gotcha. I didn't
Yeah,
catch that.
Yeah, Kevin, it's actually 73% is that fraction you see on the left.
Gotcha.
73% times 10.4. Yeah.
3.557 divided by 4.86. Yep, 73, and then times 10.4, and then times 0.75. Wow, magically it comes out to 5.7. I missed it. I thought it was an equals. I didn't catch the times between the fraction and the 10.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yep. Yeah, thank you for clarifying that. So yeah, as we see that 5.7 million, that's what we believe to be the true value of what's left on the table, if you will, to Marshall over the 30-year period. Now, again, I'm gonna reiterate this 30-year period. That is the expected or estimated remaining life of the assets. The period that we're gonna actually choose when this is finally resolved is dependent upon a number of factors that we went over. And so we've quantified it 30 years. We also looked at the 15-year period, and this calculation, if we were to replace it with the 5 million for the 15-year period, it values the entitlement rights to Marshall at 2.8 million. So again, we have a range here of 2.8 to 5.7 that is still dependent upon other factors, but it is the final valuation that we believe most appropriate for the entitlement rights.
Chris, the time frame is really primarily around the longevity of the agency, correct?
Correct.
Yeah. So if you believe the agency has an indefinite time period, 30 would be the appropriate number. If you believe that the agency is pushing it to go beyond 15 years, then you would be more inclined to use 15-year number. Any questions on this? Any additional questions? This is the key slide right here.
This is Kevin from Clinton. So if you go back with the avoided cost and you do it over 30 years, you're looking at $10.4 million. And I'd want to see the slides and everything, but I understand how you come up with that. So that's 10.4 million. So then if Marshall decides to progress with that, it would be a negotiated number, but somewhat in that range, maybe higher, maybe lower. The two communities try to figure things out. So then they would be assuming the risk that the agency will be viable going forward. What if things change, which, well, they always do, and the agency in 10, 15, or 20 years is no longer functional or needed. There's another way to do it. The transmission, I understand, when the agency dissolves, the transmission rights go away. Well, from our perspective, even if we reorganized, why would we make the agency go away when we have that asset? But, hypothetically, if it did go away and they paid 10 million, then they would be taking that risk. Then you go back to your other factors right here in front of us on the slide. If you look at 75% of the cost, how we allocate it today, that would be 5.7 million paid out as it's used based upon who uses it. Even if we agreed as an agency that Marshall could use it, this seems to be a more reasonable number if I was looking to purchase something. Does that make sense? I guess this slide is really important to me.
Yes.
If I was looking to buy.
Kevin, you're exactly right. So we talked a lot about this 10.4 million as the net present value. We really want to focus in on this 2.8 million to 5.7 million number because that's the true valuation. That 10.4 million, once again, includes that 1.3 megawatts of Union City's share that would be redistributed to Marshall anyway. So from Marshall's perspective, that's really not on the table, if you will. That's that's not of value to them. And then again, we hit it with the 75% as well, because also from Marshall's perspective, they can reach out to other members that aren't using their entitlement rights and buy it at a reduced rate. So not the Michigan joint zonal rate, which it would otherwise pay, it would pay 75% of that level. And that's why we got to the 5.7 million number.
Okay, and I guess that makes sense. The other thing, if you had the concern about the 30 years, the agency, again, if we've got this kind of asset, it'd be crazy to make the agency go away. You would continue it. Look at how we managed in the past with staff, switch to AMP. The agency still exists, it's just managed different. So it would be really foolish on our part to let the agency slip if we've got the transmission assets. And then the other thing, when you look at the 10.4 million, you've also got a lot of assumed cost over time. Who knows how all that plays out? What if we get more distributed generation and there's cost effective stuff? What if Marshall gets solar put in their community and it's behind the meter and they can offset, maybe not need as much? So there's other considerations going forward with technology. You look how things with distributed generation have progressed maybe over 5 years. I could see that happening even more in the future. You look at batteries, you look at other assets. I think we're trying to rely less on transmission going forward, be more distributed. So that would put pressure on the 5.7 in my mind. Just trying to think out loud because you're here and you're an expert.
Yeah, I think that's a fair thing to say, Kevin, that there's this question around as more storage comes into play, more distributed generation, and we have a FERC order 2222 that's encouraging more wholesale DERs, distributed energy resources, being bid into the market, that you would expect over time there's going to be a proliferation of, and there has been, right, solar and wind, of DERs, plus you've got fuel cells, you get all sorts of things coming out that will impact the need for transmission. Now, I would argue that it won't affect existing transmission. In other words, you're not going to rip out any transmission that already exists, right? It will mainly erode the need for new transmission, building of new transmission, but it won't diminish the need for existing. Nobody's going to go around ripping out transmission. So,
and I would agree with you. And going forward, it's going to be harder and harder to build transmission or more costly. So then the cost would go up. And so that would argue a higher than 5.7 number. I would agree with that comment wholeheartedly.
Yeah, now there's one key assumption here that I don't know if you guys picked up on, and ladies, sorry, Pam, that is the zonal growth rate, the rate change per year. Okay, so we went through this. Chris had a methodology to develop the projected annual transmission revenue requirement for the next 30 years, correct, Chris? 30 years?
Yes.
And we use the MISO, which happens to be the MISO load growth rate and the METC growth rate are the same, 0.4% per year. So with that, we came up with the 3.7% per year growth rate. Now, those of you who have been around for a while know that the METC growth rate has been higher than that. However, we're assuming here that there will be some taming of that rate going forward based on saturated market and the fact that DERs will erode that somewhat in the future, the need for new transmission. Now, we did some sensitivity, and Chris, numbers we ran were, instead of having a growth rate of 3.7% per year, say it was 5.7% per year. In other words, an annual growth rate on average over the 30-year period raised from 3.7 to 5.7, 2% more. What would that do to our 30-year value here of 10.4 million that you see on this page? It would increase it by about 1.3 million. Okay, so instead of 10.4, we would see 11.7 roughly. Okay, that's about a 12.5% increase. It would correspondingly, the math would work out that that 5.7 million would be 12.5% higher if indeed the METC, the Michigan Joint Zone Rate, which consists of Consumers Energy and METC, if that were to increase at a higher rate, instead of 3.7% per year, it would be 5.7% per year. That 5.7 million would be 12.5% higher. Okay, so that gives you an idea of the sensitivity to the rate change that METC portends here. You follow me on that, or any questions around that? I assume that was clear then.
Yeah, this is Kevin from Clinton. That makes sense to me. Conversely, you could argue there could be things in the future that would, the need being less, that could also be a smaller growth. But again, you're not talking the need for transmission, it's the cost of it. So, and it seems like cost in the past several years have been much higher than 3.7 per year. So
it has. And the only thing that's diminished that, as we all know, is the tax cut, right? Yeah, that's the only thing that's dampened the METC rate, the zonal rate, is the tax cut. You take the tax cut and the ROE reduction for, that was several years ago, when the ROEs went down from 12.38 down to roughly 10. That was a big hit, but that's already played itself out. But the tax cut was a big one. That had a big impact on dampening the rates. And to some extent, we still see some residual effects from that, because the way it works is that some of these accumulated deferred income taxes have to be refunded back. And so we're seeing some amortization of those going forward. So we're seeing this throughout MISO. All the IOUs and Transcos have got to continue to refund some of this tax cut. So anyway, that's otherwise the historical rate would even be higher. If you look at the numbers for METC historically, they're really quite high relative to the others. They're on the high end of the, of the zones in MISO.
One thing I want to point out, kind of changing subject here real quick, if I may, as we look to sell our seat essentially at the agency, it is a matter of perspective, and we talked about this before on other meetings with MCR. I do want to point out that we in Union City look at it as we are looking to give up our 4.86 number. So our valuation might be a different perspective than Marshall's, which may look at it minus that 1.303 megawatts. So there is a matter of perspective there. And from our perspective, from Union City giving that up, we do look more towards the 4.86 of what we're giving up leaving the agency. I just wanted to point that out.
Fair enough. That's a fair point.
I have a comment over in Hillsdale. It appears that basically Coldwater and Hillsdale would be giving up any future assignment of, if Union City walked away, we actually would be assigned our pro rata share of that 4.86 megawatts. And we're getting no value for that if Union City were to walk away. Basically, so if we play this out, let's just say, and I'm going to use Coldwater for an easier example. So if they would get, and I'm throwing the number out, 2.5 megawatts automatically assigned to them if Union City walked away, why would they support this? Because in fact, they're going to lose money. The same thing for Hillsdale. We would be giving up future use of that transmission for Coldwater's sake, and in Hillsdale's sake, we would be giving up actual cash because we would be giving up maybe 1.5 megs of margin that we would capture by the 75% margin there that we sell to Marshall and Coldwater at. So what would be the benefit for Coldwater or Hillsdale to support this type of transaction?
Well, I'll jump in. I mean, this presentation, that's why the whole board is seeing it. The whole board is going to have to approve whatever agreements to allow Union City to leave. I mentioned right in the beginning other assets and liabilities, so which include the MERS retirement share that would be part of Union City's from Project One. They are in AFEC, so this is something that the board is going to have to work through. We as Marshall understand that it's got to be approved by the board. These are I'm going to let Chris jump in here. This is the desires of the Union City Village Board, but again, the board has to approve. Up to this point, all costs from MCR, Jennings Strauss, Miller Campfield, we have been sharing in to get to this point. So maybe Chris, you want to, because you actually have told me the desires of your village board.
Well, I think, whoops, I thought somebody else was talking for a second. I'll just say real quick, as we look to, basically what we're looking to do is sell our seat. This isn't a situation where we may walk away either way, but there are liabilities that come with that too, with that seat too, as well at our table. So there's a lot to consider there. There's a lot of risk. There's a lot of that, and it would be between the members, but Union City didn't go into this just with a thought of just walking away. It was more of a look at what we could potentially sell this asset for, that our ownership stake, our seat at the table, and what we own it for. So I think that, I don't know if that kind of answers the question, but that's kind of what we're looking at it. There's a lot more that comes with it than just the transmission, and there are, as Tom said, liabilities too as well.
Okay, David first.
This is a question for Tom or Chris. How long, in regards to the negotiating process, I know this is the first step in that. When do you anticipate, if you were to come to an agreement, when do you anticipate it would be brought to the board for actual consideration, given there's multiple avenues of this negotiation that have to be determined?
I would
Go ahead, Chris.
I would guess this would take a couple more months. I mean, we still have not had this presentation to our councils, which we would like to do, to have our council. I've talked to our council about this, but I know we haven't even had this joint presentation between Marshall's council and our council to show this slides to. So I would anticipate it would take at least a couple months down the road. Unless you have anything to add to that, Tom.
Thing would be is somewhere before we go to Miller Campfield to develop all the agreements that are needed, which includes the way in the beginning, Chris mentioned about the WDS, the wholesale distribution, and agency being an agent for. There's a lot of pieces to this. So again, we're really working at the speed that Union City would like to do this, but I could see we would want to wrap this up in 3 or 4 months, like Chris said. I know Pam, we were excuse me, we were talking about doing a work session. We haven't set a date up, but I think this is absolutely it's a huge decision and a huge discussion. So I think that's where some of these finer points. Now, MCR was hired to look at valuation of the transmission, which I think they've done a great job. Thank you guys for helping us on this, because this has never been done. And so we have a working document now to see if we can accomplish, the desires of the Union City Board. Kevin?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just want to mention that, first off, I'm sorry to hear, that Union City potentially is leading, after all the decades, but I do understand, if that's what they're looking at doing, we will support them in that. Just sorry to see it. I know this is the first study right here, and there's a lot for us to digest. I've made a lot of notes and things. I know that we need a little time to look into it. Dave's got some good questions. I mean, I've had similar but different questions. I look to the MERS. There's different things there that have to be factored in. I think Chris had mentioned that, and those are important to consider. From my perspective, my philosophy has been I want to do something that is generally in the agency's best interest, and I think it's good that we're looking into it, and we just, I think, need to keep talking about this and try to work through some of the details. Hypothetically, if Marshall was to get it, well, there'd have to be an allocation taken where the transmission value would be reduced to offset some of the liability they would assume on MERS. And if other members are interested in something, well, then they're going to have to look at offsetting some of the MERS. And so there's pros and cons with everything. This is the first step on the transmission. The next step will be to plug some of the other costs in and figure those out. So enough said, I'm interested in working forward to see if we can do something in the agency's best interest.
And the discussion of what happens post us if we do end up leaving would largely be to the board, but I think the cleanest example would be just somebody essentially taking our seat. That seems pretty clean that way, that if they're taking all of our liabilities and assets, then that seems a pretty clean, you're just swapping a name out. But I guess that'll be good for discussion in our workshops and stuff like that.
Okay. Any other, Kevin?
I just agree with what Chris said. That seems logical.
Okay. I guess any questions from the AMP staff that have been sitting through this?
No questions from me, Tom.
Okay.
I do want to thank MCR and also AMP has been very helpful as we look to other agencies to if we move on, and they've been very helpful getting a lot of data and information. I appreciate that, and I think MCR has done a great job with the presentation here too as well. So we've been very happy with it, what we've seen.
Thank you, appreciate that. We will, by the way, get you a clean version of this with the two. I've noted two things we have to change. One that I noted, and the other one was a number change from 4.28 to 4.0. So we'll get a clean version out.
Okay. Well, again, thank you to MCR. I want you to know to the rest of the board, they spent a lot of time on this. We have had several presentations and walkthrough, and so it's been, they made it, the last slide really, after months of work, this slide really that's on the screen is the key to the whole project. So again, thank you. And at this point, I guess we'll move on with the agenda if everybody's okay with that. And again, MCR, you're welcome to stay on or drop off. But again, thank you, and we'll be talking to you. Thank you very much.
All right, you're welcome. Thank you. Well, if you need us, send us an email. We'll drop off.
Okay, you were a good find for us, so thank you.
All right, bye-bye.
Thank you.
Okay, we're going to move on to financial finance report. I guess Tom, you're going to run with that.
Yes, just a few things I want to point out in the finance report. We did at the end of September, the agency had $3.1 million posted with MISO and collateral. We did make a request for a collateral return of $1.5 million in October, just last week. So some of that collateral has been returned. You'll see that on the financials next month. And I do have 3 additional reports after the audit with Baker Tilly has been completed and approved. In your packet, you'll see the member equity statement, the cash reserve, and the rate stabilization annual update. So we can go over those after financial statements and invoices, if that's good with you.
Any questions for Tom on his report? If not, we'll move on to approval of the September 2020 financial statements and investment report. So take a motion, support, and then discussion.
Clinton will make that motion to approve those reports.
Is there a second?
Hillsdale will second.
Okay. Any questions? All right, we've got a motion support, and Tricia, if you would.
Member Mackey,
Yes.
Member Mathis,
Yes.
Member Tarkowitz,
Yes.
Member Bud,
Yes.
Member Cornish.
Yes.
Thank you. Next is the approval of the September 2020 invoices.
Clinton will make that motion to approve the invoices.
Union City will second.
Okay, any questions from the board? Okay, Tricia again.
Member Mathis,
Yes.
Member Tarkowitz,
Yes.
Member Bud,
Yes.
Member Cornish,
Yes.
Member Mackey.
Yes.
Okay, it's approved. Next on our agenda is the member equity statement annual report, and it looks like Tom's going to take that.
Yes. I'm
Okay.
going to share my screen so I can bring this up. Oops. Sorry. There we go. Are you able to see my screen okay?
That's good.
Okay, I can make it a little bigger too. So this is the recurring annual report, member equity statement. Several members have requested this on a preliminary basis for use in their audits for fiscal year end 6/30. It is shows the net equity ownership by agency, for the agency by member. It ties to the audited financials. And it shows the percentage ownership at the very bottom. I don't know if there's any questions that anyone has. I know it's a recurring report that you receive. I don't know if there's any approval or motion that you do make on this, or whether it's just presented. But I will take any questions if there is any. It did follow a similar format as prior years.
Any questions for Tom? I'm trying to think back. Do we need to accept this, or was this? I'm trying to remember how we did in the past.
We could receive and refile that report.
I'm willing to do that.
Clinton will make a motion to receive and file the member equity statement. I guess I'd say for June 30 of 2020.
Tell you what, Kevin, can we hold? Would it be acceptable because we have another report and maybe do them, save some roll calling here if we maybe accept these all at the same time? Would you be?
I will withdraw my motion.
Okay, thank you. Any questions on the equity statement? If not, we'll move on to the cash reserve and fund balance policy annual report.
Sure. Similar time period. So this is the cash reserve and fund policy balance as of 6/30/2020. The balances listed in this report tied to your audited financials. So under your current policy, you have 6 different factors that go into your cash reserve. After 6/20 or 6/30/20, really only the first 3 factors are the because you no longer have debt with project 4, capital improvements or special needs. So the first 3 factors are the main factors that I took into account when updating this policy for fiscal year end 6/30/20. So I'm going to go down. I'll come back to this page in 1 second. I'm going to go to the actual calculations for the components. So the first component is the O&M expense. It looks at your 2021. It looked at the budgeted O&M expense, which was $58 million. The current policy has a factor of 16.4% in order to have 60 days cash on hand. There was an increase in the budget from actual of 2020. A lot of it was due to the Zone 4 capacity or Zone 7 capacity increase.
Hey, when you look at the O&M, would that be for transmission? Is that project 4?
No project 4, because there isn't any project 4 on the books.
Oh, so the O&M would be transmission then?
The transmission, purchase power, it's straight from your budget.
Okay, no, gotcha. I forgot about that being transferred on project 4.
Yep. And then the rate base factor, which is a smaller component, it looks at the assets, which as of 2021 going forward is a lot of what we talked about, or a lot about what was talked about earlier, transmission related assets. You can see it's the 86,000, which is a smaller component of the total. And then the third component is your MISO cash collateral and cash collateral reserve amount. What this looks at is your highest exposure in the prior year. So you can see in 2020, your highest exposure was just over $2 million. In 2020, you had a $900,000 credit line with MISO. So it looks like your cash collateral posting at high, which is the difference between your highest exposure and what your credit limit is with MISO, was 1.19 million. It adds back that highest hour or highest day exposure, and your total cash reserve component of the MISO collateral for last year was $3.28 million. Looking at 2021, we know back in July when we had to make all those additional postings that you had several days where your credit exposure was pretty high. There was on 7/20, your exposure was 3.5 million. So that's why you can see when I'm doing the projection for the cash reserve policy for 2021, you'll see this number is higher because that's a number we already reached. So taking those 3 calculations into account, for fiscal year 2020, the minimum cash reserve is $11.2 million. The agency at 6/30/20, I'm sorry, this should be 2020. At 6/30/20 had $19.5 million. So you exceeded your minimum cash balance as an entire agency. And then when we project out future years, the current policy has a minimum balance of 16 million. At 6/30/20, it looks at what your cash on hand is at 6/30/20, and you're over that as well. So there doesn't look, based on the current policy, doesn't look to be any issues with the agency as a whole. Yes.
Back on that, with your 21, we're going from 11 million to 16 to 13. I see line item number 1 going from 48 to 58, and then back to 52. What's the jump? I mean, is capacity tied in there, or what's the 10 million then back off 6 in 22?
So we had in July, in July 20th, we had the high exposure. We had to post collateral with MISO.
Gotcha.
One point you had, I mean, typically you only had about $1 million posted with MISO. That at that peak in July, you had about $3.5 million posted with MISO. So that's what kind of had the jump in the MISO cash collateral and reserve portion. And then the O&M expense, there was a little jump because of the, going back down to this calculation, the MISO Zone 7 capacity increase.
Okay, so you got capacity and congestion basically are two big factors because that was a big jump.
And then what I did in the future years for 22 and 23 for your O&M expense, I just kind of did an average of these 3 years. Because I didn't think, I mean, hopefully your capacity for Zone 7 is lower in future years. So, and same with MISO, hopefully your exposure isn't as high as this year. So I did these two represent an average of these 3 years.
Okay, it's a guessing game, but thank you.
Yep. And then there's a breakdown by member as well. So for fiscal year 2020, you have your minimum cash reserve, the $11.2 million. That's what ties to what we looked at just a second ago. And it shows the, on this line is your available cash balance by member. There isn't any issues. Everyone meets their minimum balance. The one thing we do want to look at as we project out, and especially in 2021, when we project that there's that higher O&M expense and higher MISO exposure, playing into higher minimum balance for 2021. Marshall, based on their balances in 2019, might not meet their minimum cash reserve. So that's something we'll want to keep an eye on.
So Tom, should we be planning on depositing money back into those funds?
I mean, I can definitely keep an eye on it.
Okay.
I set this up in a way where it's something I could every other month I could rerun, just to kind of get an idea of where we're at. I know you did make a change last month where you said you no longer wanted to draw down on reserve funds. So that would probably included in this line is your rate stabilization. So I don't expect your rate stabilization to go down any further. So I can keep an eye on it and let you know as time goes.
All right.
If that seems all right with you. And I know several members have also expressed the interest in looking at the actual policy itself and seeing if it's a little too conservative from what I've heard. So maybe that might be an option as well.
Mr. Chairman, when you look at the cash reserve policy, I sort of remember that Jeff and I were going to work with Tom, but we dealt with a couple other things, more recently being transmission. Mr. Chairman, is that something that Tom and Jeff and I will work on over the next couple months?
I think it'd be great, and that can be another topic for our work session.
Okay. I think it'd be neat, though, if Tom and Jeff and I can sort of fine tune a few things. Jeff's really got to be involved because I think he's got great insight that needs to be shared with us.
Okay.
I can set something up with the finance committee and Pam and I.
Thank you.
Sure. And then the final page of this is just the summary of the balance by fund. You have several different funds that have different methods of allocation. One that I think this is similar to what we reviewed back in May, I believe, when we did the member equity withdrawal. So this is as of 6/30/2020 as well.
Okay, thanks, Tom. Before we get into rate stabilization annual update, there's really no action on that. Am I correct? So we could take these other reports, going back to Kevin, if you would.
This is Clinton. Help me if you need to, Mr. Chairman, but I will make a motion that we receive and file the member equity statement annual report for 2020 and the cash reserve and fund balance policy annual report for 2020. And whoever's doing the minutes, you can make that sound better.
Okay, is there support?
Union City will support.
Thank you, Chris. Tricia, are you okay with that motion?
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay, any other questions? Okay, Tricia,
Member Bud,
Yes.
Member Cornish,
Yes.
Member Mackey,
Yes.
Member Mathis,
Yes.
Member Tarkowitz.
yes. Thank you, Tricia. Okay, Tom, moving on to rate stabilization annual update.
Sure. I believe in similar to prior years, you have a rate stabilization policy, which I believe is attached. You do a calculation looking at your highest projected draw, and you take a factor of 6. So, for example, Clinton, looking at the 12-month billing projection, their highest projected draw is about $10,391. A factor of 6 is 62,000. They currently have a balance of 1.2 million, so they exceed their minimum rate stabilization required. I attached the projection sheet where I calculated in red is the highest projection or highest projected withdrawal used in that policy. So not much to it. It didn't look like there was any issues with anyone not meeting their policy requirements. I think from what I understand, it looks like it's a recommendation, not necessarily a strict as like the cash reserve policy where it's not as strict. So, but it doesn't appear that there's any issues.
Okay, well, thank you, Tom, for doing that. Any
Sure.
questions on the rate stabilization? Again, Tom, thank you for all your work. We do appreciate it.
Sure, and I believe looking at the policy, this is supposed to be presented every 6 months, so I'll try to get on a regular schedule for this one.
Okay, great. Thank you. Okay, moving down to management. Pam, General Manager's report.
Thanks, Tom. For the most part, I can stand on the report. A couple of things. I did want to bring you up to speed on the capacity proposal that we talked about during our special board meeting. We did submit on that. We were notified that we were shortlisted on both of our proposals. And they're requesting firm pricing. I believe it's the end of this week. So we just plan to resubmit our initial proposal. Also, T is updating the analysis on Coldwater, Peking, Marshall, Energy Center, and capacity options. We can present that either at the December board meeting, or we can talk about it for the work session, depending on when we decide to schedule that as well, Tom. I have Chris on. Chris, is there anything on MISO highlights you wanted to present to the board?
I think we'd be okay standing on the report, and if anybody has any questions they want to ask, either as a group or individually, we're available to answer or provide more details on anything.
Okay, thanks, Chris. I think that's it, Tom.
Okay, let's keep going down. Nothing new on Coldwater or
yeah, that Chris, you want to give an update on the delay again at MISO, in the MISO queue?
One of the items from the report is that MISO is making a change to how they model dispatching. I think it's mostly the solar units and then also some energy storage, like battery type resources. And so MISO is saying that they think it's going to be a 6 to 8 week delay on the queue, but that they won't commit to. They kind of hold out hope that it might not be that long, but it almost sounds like if it goes anyway, it'll be a little bit longer than that.
So we're probably in January timeframe now, Tom.
Okay, thank you, Chris. Okay, Marshall Energy Center, Pam, anything that you've heard, or I'm going to ask Ed Rice the same question, so.
We did, as I think I told the board, had a call with Willard. We did receive an updated term sheet that's been provided to T to include in their analysis.
Okay. Ed, anything that you've talked to Willard in the last couple weeks?
No,
there he goes.
just trying to, no, I spoke with Willard a couple weeks ago, and he still anticipates starting construction late this spring of 21.
Okay, we'll keep you all involved, informed on that. Okay, moving on to discussion on the MISO historic unit considerations, the new acronym that the HUCs. Okay, so who did take that?
Chris is. Chris, I'll pull it up for you.
Do you want me to share my screen?
I think is mine up?
Yep, I see it.
Okay, go ahead, Chris.
So some time ago, MISO created these things called historic unit considerations. They folded it into the rules for capacity. On this slide, we show the tariff and the business practice manual references. If you could go on to the next slide. From the tariff, there are only certain things that qualify for HUCs. It's not every capacity transaction. Grandfathered agreements, and then you have there are certain transactions where if you can show that you had a contract prior to a certain date, and then there are external zones which have a later date. The big thing with this is, there always should be some excess revenue if a zone binds, just the way the math works out on it. But this is when MISO is figuring out a priority on how to allocate excess dollars when there's a zonal price separation. Because if you have a zone, let's say it has 100 megawatts in it, and then it breaks or binds with the rest of the footprint, there may only be, based on its import capability, if it can only import 20 megawatts into the zone, well, if they're charging every megawatt in the zone that higher price of the zone, they're going to be over collecting dollars that they would be paying back to generators. So that gives them excess revenue. It's the same concept as energy congestion. But MISO it was decided, and FERC accepted way back when MISO passed I don't know if I should call it the latest version of the capacity rules, but at that point in time, what was the latest version of the capacity rules, MISO had come up with the idea to, give preference to contracts that were already in existence and were continuing into the future. Go on to the next slide. So there is the tariff has some basic criteria, and then the business practice manual breaks out and gives even more criteria about what qualifies. On this slide, you can see the list of things, again, kind of repeating what the tariff has about the grandfather agreements, the executed agreements or contracts or ownership of resources prior to July 20, 2011. And one of the key parts, at least when we've talked to MISO about this in the past, is that third sub-bullet under HUC criteria. They talk about you need network resource interconnection service or firm transmission service that is explicitly from the resource to the load zone. And we've never had that for the resources to the MSCPA load. And, one of the reasons was, as far as just putting it in and saying, okay, this is capacity and using that to offset your megawatts, it's okay to just have the NIRS service for the generator and not have a specific DNR that goes from the generator to the load. The only time it is coming into play or has come into play within the past decade has been this time when the zone bound. To get that DNR status, you go through a study with MISO, much like you would for a point-to-point service. And then at the end of the study, they'll either tell you you can get it, or they'll tell you how much money you would have to pay to build upgrades, or pay the transmission owner to build transmission system upgrades in order to get that right into the future.
Hey, Chris,
yes?
you use the acronym DNR. What's DNR stand for?
I'm sorry, Designated Network Resource.
Thank you.
It's a part of, so when you have network service, NIT service, you have the ability to go out and say, these are my firm resources. And in MISO, it doesn't do as much under the pro forma OAT. It gets you firm transmission service. So you're less likely to be cut on TLRs, whereas MISO doesn't really use TLRs. You just have congestion, which you pay whether you have firm transmission or not. Next slide, please. So on this slide, again, some more of the information about the HUCs. The part that was highlighted in an earlier version of the presentation, when you look at the business practice manual, it actually said that you have to register your HUCs by November 1st. But then MISO also has a timeline for their capacity auction, which said January 15th. And so we had checked with MISO, and they confirmed the January 15th deadline to try to register HUCs. So we had replaced this just before we sent it out to you to override what the manual had said. Go on to the next slide, please. So we've been talking to MISO. It's been kind of slow communications, especially since there's COVID and you can't corner somebody in a room anymore. It's more of a phone call kind of thing. But what we've been talking about in the past, again, they've told us that you need to be able to show that firm transmission from the source to the sink, which would be either a point-to-point or a designated network resource. So looking at that, the one option to try to firm up or get at least ensure a right to point to resources in the future and claim these HUCs would be to go through the firm transmission service process, put in ask for a DNR, pointing to the specific resources to the load. What we've seen in the past was they wanted a deposit of about $20,000, and then the studies cost in the neighborhood of $14,000. That's about the values that we saw when MSCPA had the Menominee and Aconto Falls hydros, which did not have network resource interconnection service. So we had to go through the study process just to be able to use them as capacity. And I think those were about the numbers, although it's been several years. So we're not sure exactly what those costs are today. And in any case, the final price of any study is just whatever the time they book to it and how much they bill you for it. But right now, the ones that do not have these are Prairie State or the hydros, and then any other resource that you were to buy. Although I think Prairie State and the hydros are really the only ones that would be able to meet the contract or ownership prior to the 2011 date. Anything you did today, I don't know how we would be able to show meeting that date. I think that was the last one. So for there, I mean, the one thing that, say looking at doing or what we plan to do is even though MISO has said in the past that we need the DNR, I think we can go ahead and try to submit them as is and just show the contract dates, and just point to the contracts and say, look, there's a contract here. Worst case that happens, MISO comes back again and says, hey, you don't have a DNR, designated network resource. And, if that's the case, then we could proceed with that, putting those in if you wanted to go that route. As far as getting a designated network resource prior to the upcoming auction, that might be a tight timeline because they usually take a while to run those through the process. And then if you do go through that process, you get you'll have to put up the study costs for each of them.
Okay. Any questions for Chris while we have got him on?
Yeah, I've got several. So these hucks, we were told these no way ever applied to us in the past, and now we're saying that we're going to apply for them, or we're not going to apply for them.
I mean, I think we can put it in and see what the current people say.
What's the?
we can. I'm sorry.
Yeah, and we spend $14,000. What's the potential revenue for us or offset cost?
Well, to the extent the zone never binds again, then the huck only has a value as insurance. If the zone binds again and the price in Michigan goes, very high and the rest of the footprint stays low, you would have the potential to recover some dollars, in the price difference between where the resource is and your load. But again, even that is it's not a guarantee that you get to recover that cost difference. It's completely dependent upon the amount of excess revenue that MISO collects in the auction.
So based on, like, say last year's, what would you have got based on last year? I mean, last year cost us a bunch of money because if we'd had the hucks registered last year, what would have saved us? Because we know what those numbers are.
I don't know that. I'd have to see if they published what the hucks were paid. They may have published that somewhere. I did not notice it, but we didn't have any hucks, so we don't know what they were paid. I mean, we could look at the price difference between where resources are and the load, and say what that difference is, but the huck doesn't guarantee you that price. It only gives you up to that price if there is that much excess revenue.
Yeah, I'm just trying to figure out if we would have made more with registered hucks than the $14,000. And I guess that's, in a nutshell, what my question is. How would we have known?
I'll look into that and see if they published a huck price somewhere or a huck value.
Yeah, I guess this is just different from what we were told before. Pam, why are we now looking at this?
I guess we have looked at it. It's a change in the MISO interpretation, which
got it. Okay.
They've always said we need to have firm transmission, which we do not have. And you can do the study, but then if they identify upgrades, we're going to be responsible for those upgrades. We have studied getting firm transmission from MISO to PJM on the hydros. I don't know, Chris, how many times? And the upgrades were
60 million.
It was very excessive. So I think it's worth trying and see what MISO says. Their interpretation changes based on. So.
Yeah, that makes more sense. I mean, so based on a new interpretation, which took place just in the past couple of months.
I don't know what.
Well, I mean, to be clear, we would try to submit it as is with just the contracts without having a DNR and see if the current people would accept it or not. If they say no, then we would then have the option to go with the DNR. I mean, if we go through the study process and we get lucky on it, and we've seen this in past where you go through, you do the study, they tell you 60 million in upgrades or whatever, and then you come back 6 months later, go through the study process again, and this time it's there. In other cases, you keep getting the same bad answer of millions of dollars to do upgrades. But, you know, we would try to see if the current people who process these things would let them go through. I mean, and that doesn't cost us any money to do. You just have to put it in and see what they say. You know, if they say no, then we'll have to try to go down the route of the study. If you want to do that, if you think it's worth the risk, worth the, you know, spending the study costs to try to get it.
But this is something we should have been doing all along. I know I'm putting you on the spot, and I apologize, but this is just I was shocked when I saw this.
I mean, it's hard to say. I mean, we went well over a decade with the zone never binding, so it would have been spending. I mean, guaranteed. Even if the answer was yes, you could have it. You know, it would have been spending 14 grand, and not 14 grand because you got to remember. So if we're going to point to Prairie State, Cannleton, and Smithland, that's 14 grand each. You would have been paying that. And you'd be paying it to do a study that might come back and say, you know, you got to pay millions of dollars. So then you're out 14 grand and you don't even get the HUD.
Yeah, got it. But if we had just done it the freeway, registered, we potentially could have got something this year or this past MISO year in May, if there was a payment to be made for Hucks in May of 20. With the zonal separation that took place, there was a potential there that if they would have accepted them, that we wouldn't have to pay for the study, but we would have had the Hucks and they would have been registered, potentially.
Yes, there is the potential of that. But like I said, when we've asked in the past, they've said no. So it's just, if you've ever dealt with MISO, I guess I would say it pays to ask the same question again and again and again, because sooner or later, sometimes you get a different answer. Repeat it again and again. So that's why I'm suggesting that we do this, and we'll go ahead and do it. I don't think it hurts anything. And if it doesn't work, then we could pursue the other option if that's, you know, if the insurance is worth that cost.
Yeah, no, it's just the one last year we would have loved them, or maybe. So yeah, we appreciate it. That was it.
If you can find out what the Hucks were worth last year.
Yes, I will.
Okay.
I mean, it's something like I said, we've asked about it in the past, and the answer has been no, you need this, and it's, you know, yes, we had stopped doing it because we'd received the other answer before. We'll need to start back doing it and see if that somehow their interpretation changes.
Thank you. Can you send us this presentation?
Yep, we'll do.
No, thanks.
Great. Thank you, Chris. We'll move on to the solar recommendation analysis. Not sure who's doing that.
Yeah, Mike McGlory's going to go through that, and we'll go through it high level, and then I'm going to send this out to each of you to have your own individual recommendations. But I just want to go through quickly the methodology that the Power Supply Group went through in putting together the recommendations. And I'll bring it up, Mike.
All right, thanks.
Are you seeing it?
Yeah, here's on page 30.
Gotta get to
So,
okay.
Try to come up with the methodology of, figuring out how much solar each member should take. And one of our assumptions was that we would have, multiple choices down the road. So it wasn't like Fremont where you only had one plant that was going to get built. So you'll see in number 2, we had portfolio diversification. But so the way we looked at this is we looked at 4 different criterias, and let's go through them here. Number 1 was fuel source concentration. So MISO had a study a while back that they thought that wind and solar should not be more than 10% of the total load, and that's wind 10% and solar 10%. So the first thing we said is we should, keep the amount of energy coming from solar to 10% or less. And then the second one is just the portfolio diversification. We said, okay, well, you should try to keep each project to less than 5%. Just, so spread the assets around a little bit. And then number 3 was make sure that no member is long. So if you're already long energy, didn't want to participate in another project. In MSCPA's case, most of the members have a pretty open position there. So that really, number 3 didn't really come into play. And number 4, we just looked at your, average daily peak, make sure that, your solar wasn't going to cause you to be long on an average day. And once again, since most of the members are in pretty good shape, that number 4 didn't come in. So really, you'll see at the end, number 1 and number 2 is, keeping the amount of energy less than 10% of your total portfolio, and then keeping first project that we might invest in down to 5%. So this is just an example of the total concentration. So we just used cold water in your case. Their forecast load was 515,000 megawatt hours. And as you might have noticed on the first page, we assumed 0% load growth, going forward. So we tried to stay conservative. So 10% of solar then would give you 51,549 megawatt hours of solar that you could sign up for. And we assumed a solar load factor of 21%. So we've seen some variations there. Trackers are in the 21 to 24%. Fixed panels are in the 15 to 20%. So in this case, we went a little conservative as well, 21%. So
hey, Chris, this is Kevin from Clinton.
21%.
Hey, Chris, this is Kevin from Clinton. When you look at the solar being 21%, I don't remember, specifically, but looking at some of the information I see periodically from Coldwater with their solar and stuff, I see it closer to like 11 or 12% than 21. Is the 21 somewhat accurate based on actual units up here in Northern Ohio and in Michigan? It just seems high to me, based solely on the Coldwater.
Yeah, definitely never seen 11%. It's always, I'd say the winter months are down maybe to 15 or 16%, but and if you put the trackers in, you're up in 22, 23, 24%. So
yeah, Kevin, and the proposals I've seen in Michigan currently are all bifacial panels, and they're projecting more like 25%. So.
Okay. Yeah, it's just hard. Again, hydro 58 and reality 52. So just a concern.
Yeah. So if if the load factor was smaller, that would mean you could buy more megawatts and get the same amount of energy there. So so using a higher load factor once again gives you a little conservative number of how much solar you sign up for. So so in this case, we said, Coldwater should take no more than 28 megawatts using that 21%. And they already have 1.2 from solar phase 2. So that leaves 28 minus 1.2 or 26.8 megawatts. And then the second one, as I mentioned, we said each project should be limited to 5%. So 5% of the forecasted load there yields 25,775. Backing out the load factor comes out to 14 megawatts of solar for a single project. And then the next one, we've tried to keep, members' position a little bit on the market. So we usually, try to keep worst case 10%. It doesn't always happen with all of our members. They might have lost some load or signed up for some more projects than they needed in the end there. But ideally, we would try to keep the energy at least 10% on the market. So in this case, Coldwater had 528,000 forecast load in 2025, with 44% of that open. So it's taken off their hydro, Prairie State, Fremont, and some of the blocks that MSCPA bought. So taking 40%, 44 minus the target of 10%. So they still have 34% that they could sign up for. And so it'd be 180,000 megawatt hours. Once again, using the 21%, comes up with 98.4 megawatts of available solar that they could buy. So as I mentioned, since everybody's pretty long, that number's, a lot higher than the first two numbers that we saw. And then the other one was just looking at, on a daily basis, what their daily peak is. In this case, you can see it's 74.6 minus all the different resources that they have signed up for, including, AFAC duct. We assume that's running. And then a solar phase 2, we assume that on an average daily basis, the output of solar is about 55% at the time of the peak. So the 1.2 gives them 0.6 rounded down there. And so all that, taking 74.6 minus all their different resources, yields at the bottom 22.6 megawatts available. And if you assume that only solar is going to be running 55% at the time of the peak, so 41 megawatts of solar would give you an average of 22.6 during the daily peak. And this is just sort of some pictures to make sure we're on the right track here. So the top line going straight across is their average daily peak, and that's 74.6. And then the black line is their average daily load in 2019. So Coldwater's a little bit unusual because they have the greenhouse. It usually shuts down towards the end of the day there, so in the winter. So it makes a little bit of unusual load pattern there. Then you'll just see how we loaded up their resources with the Fremont and coming in during the on-peak hours there. And so what we did is then took those four criterias and took the smallest one of the four, which in this case was at 5%, and no one project to solar. So that'd be recommended in the first solar project that we're looking to buy into or develop would be a 14 megawatt participation. And the next slide just shows you, with that 14 megawatts, with the normal solar curve there, how it fits into their daily load. So still have room for future. And also then on a longer term basis, just on an annual energy supply, where 14 megawatts at 21% load factor would fit into their overall energy supply. So you can see once again, they still have plenty of room for future projects. And then we looked at each member, just what their renewable power would be. So right now, Coldwater is at 12.8%. And, most all of the MSCPA members, you can see once as we recommended 5% of solar. So now they're with the solar, they'd be at 17.8%.
Mike?
Yes.
Isn't that short of where we're supposed to be though?
Yeah, this would be, Jeff, but this is just our recommendation for this first PPA. We're going to recommend additional solar PPAs.
Thank you.
Yep.
Yeah, we did not include the criteria of any renewable portfolio standards. So this is just more looking on the power supply energy side there.
But that's the purpose of this slide, Jeff, was to show where we are compared to the RPS.
Thank you.
Yep.
Okay, so then the rest of the members, you'll notice that everybody limits, the smaller of the four criterias was the 5% participation. So Clinton's case, that came out to 0.6 megawatts of solar. And see how that fits in on an average daily curve versus still below their average daily peak there. Yes. So so Clinton has a large amount of hydro, so they'd be in good shape with just a single project there, 35%. Marshall, once again, we used conservative approach. We took your current load. We didn't add any of the new load that's coming on. Just didn't want to plan for that until it showed up there. So we used 112,000 forecast, and that came out to 3 megawatts of recommended solar. So that would, so based on the current load, that would give you 31% of renewable, but we'd have to look at the latest load forecast to see how, what that would do to your renewable power with the extra load coming on there. In Hillsdale, once again, the 5% limit based on 128,000 megawatt hours of forecast load to give you a 3.5 megawatt recommendation for solar. Once again, good 31% renewable. And finally, Union City, same thing, the 5% limit kicked in. So out of 17,000 megawatt hour forecast, recommendation would be a 0.5 megawatt of solar participation. And so, Union City's similar to Coldwater on the lower side of the renewable, with 15% with the solar coming in.
Thanks, Mike. So as I said, Tom, we actually have done this for all of AMP members. But for this group, we're obviously going to be looking at a PPA in Michigan. We're working with MPPA on that. So this is just to give us an idea of the amount of capacity we may want out of this first PPA. And I will go ahead and send each of these to each member for their individual recommendations.
And Pam, would we at some point go into closed session to discuss the terms of the PPA?
Yes, definitely.
Thank you.
And I think that might be good during our work session as well.
Thank you.
Pam, how does that relate to then the Coldwater peaking project if we're still on there? Does that, I mean, if it says we need so much solar, why are we moving forward with even looking at the project 4 or Prop 5, I'm sorry.
So this is really a more of an energy resource.
Different than capacity, okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yep.
Moving on to discussion of the transmission entitlement payment. Looks like Tom, you're up.
Sure. I think I can, I'll do a quick review of the 4 different options that were discussed with the Finance Committee 2 weeks ago. Let me actually, I'm going to share my screen and I'll pull up the memo. Can you see the memo?
Yes.
Okay. So we have the 4 different options. I guess we're trying to provide some clarity as far as what was discussed middle of the year and the resolution that was set forth mid-year regarding the transmission sharing rate credit. So there is 4 different options that were discussed. Option 1 is 75% of the MISO METC transmission rate. Option 2 is what was presented earlier in the year during the original workshop, or the first workshop that we did, was the MSCPA grandfathered rate grossed up by 75%. Option 3 was the transmission sharing rate, which is 75% of the sum of MISO's Schedule 9 and Schedule 26, which that option is comparable to what MPPA currently does. And then option 4 is 75% of the avoided costs between the MISO transmission rate and the grandfathered MSCPA grandfathered transmission rate. So what I did in this is I listed the different rates in the next section. And this was, I used September 2020 as an example because that was the most recent month that I had. So you can see the MISO METC transmission rate for your zone, the MSCPA grandfather transmission rate, and then I listed the Schedule 9 and Schedule 26 components of the rates above, just should you need that for review in option 3. And then the section below is I put a formula in there just to kind of hopefully whenever we can get some clarity on going forward, the formula that I'm going to use to calculate the transmission credit and prorate it back on members based on their unused portion of that allocation. So I don't know if Jeff or Kevin have anything additional to add. I know they recommended either option 1 or option 2, and they recommended proactively or retroactively going back July, August, and September and adjusting that, spreading that adjustment out over 3 months. So I'll let them add anything else that they might want.
This is Kevin from Clinton. Just wanted to throw in there that, we're leaning more towards option 1. It just seems simpler. There's a METC rate, and whoever wants to use the power gets a discount of 25% off of that rate. It's a simple calculation going forward. We looked seriously at option 3, which is supposed to be based upon how MPPA does it. But that and 4 got really complicated. And who says that that's even done in a fair way? Hey, the simplest thing, the rate is whatever it is, and the MSCPA member gets a 25% discount or pays 75% of it. That was one of the primary factors for me going forward with that, among other things.
Can you remind how we did this, how we are doing it right now? Are we doing option 1 right now?
Currently, my interpretation of the motion was option 4 is how we're currently doing it.
Okay, thank you.
I guess from when Kevin and I were talking about, we're doing option 4, but we never discussed how when we were making the motion, number 4 was never even we never even talked about doing it that way. So, and again, I guess in my opinion, because I'm the one that made the motion, I wouldn't have agreed to that because we were all talking about the MPPA rate, how we said we should probably be close to that rate. But again, obviously I'm going to say option 2 and everybody else is going to say option 4. So I get that. But again, I'm not opposed to option 1 because that's kind of what I always thought, because in terms of, if you read the motion, it says avoided costs. Well, COWAR's avoided cost is that every megawatt I pay is that 5176. So yes, I'm getting a 20% discount. You're getting a 25% premium. So that's kind of where I am on that, because and again, we were shown when we were having the discussions, I think Tom said he showed option 3 was what we were kind of looking at in the worksheet. So, but we never saw option 4 at all, which is what we're getting billed at.
And I would just like to add, I agree with what Jeff said. Option 4, when you get down to the detail and Tom breaks it out for us, it's really, to me, really convoluted. I don't even know how you come up with it. I just think 1 or 2 are easy, and I like 1. There's no doubt in my mind, 1's the simplest. It's the rate. whoever buys my stuff gets a 25% discount, or I get 75% of it. That's just the simplest thing. The others get complicated. I just wanted to reiterate that.
I'm good with option 1, 2. It makes sense. I think that was my initial understanding of how it would work, would be 25% off to both parties, plus or minus, depending on which side of the aisle you're on there. It makes sense. So
I would say from Hillsdale's standpoint, both Chris and I believed that we were looking at option 1 as well, and we would be fine with that.
Well, I'm hearing like somewhat option 1 is the sort of lead. I guess to finally clarify this, we should have a motion to go with this rate option.
I'll make a motion. We go with option 1 for the formula calculation, which is 75% between the METC MISO rate and the transmission share rate. I don't know if I read that correctly, but that option 1, as it says there.
Retroactive back to July 1, correct?
Retroactive back to July 1, that's correct.
And Chris, not wanting to put words in your mouth, but it's retroactive to July 1 with the retroactivity spread through the next 3 months, I think. We don't want to hit anybody with one big month, so we want to spread it out over 3 months. And then, if possible, Tom, looking to you, we want to make sure it's real clear. It's just simply METC's MISO rate. The member buying the power will get the METC MISO rate at 75% of that rate. Just something where it's really clear, even if there's an example shown in the motion somehow, or if there's a preceding thing above it that shows the formula, that would be good too.
I think in my opinion, the motion should just reference this memo. And you could say option 1.
Well, I like that too.
And we can just include the memo in the minutes.
Good. I just want to make sure it's clear because, 5 years from now, we might not remember. So thank you.
Okay, I think Chris Mathis made the motion, but I don't know if I heard a support.
Hillsdale will support option 1.
Thank you, David. Any further discussion? Okay, Tricia?
Yes.
Are you?
Don't ask me if I have it. I think I have it. We're
Okay,
good.
we can double check it. So there's a motion by Union City, supported by Hillsdale.
No. Member Cornish,
Yes.
Member Mackey,
Yes.
Member Mathis,
Yes.
Member Tarkowitz,
Yes,
Member Bud.
Yes.
thank you, Tom. Thank you also for all the work we did to clarify this, but took us a while, but I think we finally got there. So thank you
Should be
again.
good now. Thank you.
Okay, record retention storage proposal.
Yeah, that was included in the packets. You want me to pull it up?
Could you, Pam?
Yeah.
So if I can add maybe why we brought that back up, obviously we like to get that all cleaned up. We have had Harold has been going through and cleaning out as much as he can over, the last couple months. So we've got rid of a whole bunch of stuff already. And then the lady who sent us this original proposal basically came back and said, hey, we can do it in stages or however it goes. So Harold remeasured all of the remaining files, and there's probably still some things we could get rid of, but again, it's how much time do we spend doing that or just making everything that. So that's why I gave this back to. They had them update this with new numbers, because the first number was like 80,000, I think, from memory, or 70,000. So it's at least cut in half. So for what it's worth.
What's the pleasure of the board?
Clinton likes the idea. We can clean that up and get those electronically. We can then reduce that rental space or eliminate that rental space there. So from that perspective, I like it. If there are no objections, I'd be willing to make a motion, but I don't want to proceed the discussion. I don't hear any discussion. Clinton will make a motion to authorize the file storage contract with Superior Document Solutions in the amount of $29,640.65.
Hillsdale will support that motion.
What would be the 29,000? What would be the split on this as it pertains to our agreement on the cost split? Would it be along project
one?
Okay.
Did I hear that it would be split by project one? Was that?
I heard somebody say that. I
said that, Hillsdale, but I'm not official.
Okay.
I would say project one would be appropriate. This all relates to project one. It doesn't relate to.
Okay.
Clinton would like to amend its motion to wherever I left off, put comma with cost allocated based upon project one percentages.
Okay.
Tricia, you can clean that up any way that works for you. I don't care.
Okay. So we got a motion and support to hire Superior Document Solutions for $29,640.65 to be split to the members based on project one.
Tom, do we need to add this to the budget? So,
Well, you've already got an adopted budget.
It'd just be a budget amendment maybe later if we go over.
I mean, it's definitely not in the budget. We can add it.
right. Okay. Just want to make it aware that's not in the budget currently.
Right, and then we'll, at the end of the year, we'll do a budget, adjustment amendment as we get closer to June.
Okay.
And just for future reference, because we're an enterprise zone, we're not required to amend the budget. Bylaws might say differently. I'd have to check them, but being an enterprise zone, there is no true requirement to have an amended budget.
And we may come within the budget anyways. We have money allocated for things, so we'll think positive.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, motion support, Tricia, please.
Member Mackey,
Yes.
Member Mathis,
Yes.
Member Tarkowitz,
Yes.
Member Bud,
Yes.
Member Cornish.
Yes.
Thank you. Other business.
Nothing from our perspective, Tom.
Okay. Public comments on non-agenda items. Pat, do we have anybody out there?
This is Sheila. I'm covering for Pat, and I do not see any hands that are raised. If anybody wants to make a public comment, please press *9 on your phone. There is none.
Thank you, Sheila. Okay. Commissioners' comments and members' municipal update. We'll start with Union City.
Thanks, Tom. We've got, as we speak, we're taking out our 3 diesel generators that we bought in 1941, 1945, 1952. Those are coming out of our building as we make room for our new substation and switchgear. So that's underway. We ordered a new transformer, switchgear, and that's the new substation. Looks like it's about 20 to 26 weeks away. So we're excited about that. It's nice to finally get that upgrade. We'll be going from a 5 megawatt substation to a 10 megawatt that can perform up to 18. We did some work at our dam. We took out a bunch of bad concrete, redoing our catwalk, and we're just about done with that project. Our lake is refilling now. We had to take that down 3 feet, and that's about it.
Okay. Kevin, Clinton.
Basically trying to wrap up some of the construction projects, get prepped for winter things, working on a water project. And of course, we're working on the transformer, new substation, but trying to get some studies done with John Courtney for the power supply. Then once we get that, then work into a cost of service study, anticipating what power is, anticipating the cost of the new transformer, and then projecting what rates would be. At the moment, it looks like, yeah, again, hoping sales hold, that we would have a 2.5% to 3% rate increase over a 20-year period to finance the balance of that substation. That's about it.
Okay. Hillsdale.
Okay, last night we swore in our updated council with one new member coming on board. Dealing with the COVID restrictions within the staff and within the community, as the numbers for all of us are on an uptick. We, as Kevin said, we're wrapping up kind of our road and projects for the year to get them tightened up before weather turns really bad. So we've got a one road project that includes a box culvert over the St. Joe River, and some other things. Chris's crews are working on the lead service line replacement requirements, and we're making some progress on that. And then that's pretty much it for now.
Okay. Coldwater?
Yes, we are experiencing higher COVID. That's why we had to go to all electronic today. So we've actually closed our city hall. Last Friday, we had several employees that were either a primary contact or had it themselves. So we've made some steps to kind of try to keep containing that. We went back to staggered work shifts where our field crews, so we don't have less people occupying the same space. Fiber project, we hope to be hooking up beta customers again soon. So probably be kicking that off over the next 60 days. Substations wrapping up, should be energizing here December, January timeframe, and we're wrapping up our final pump station. And we also had one council member who was running unopposed be reelected, so we're good.
Okay, thank you, Jeff. Ed, you want to update on electric for us?
No update at this time, Tom.
Okay. We had two new council members. We had two of our council members run unopposed. We had two new council members elected. They'll be seated in January. Also on the ballot, we had a $4.75 million street bond approved. We'll be doing about 17 miles of street over a 3-year period. So that'll keep people here busy. MDOT's hopefully going to open up South Kalamazoo 227. They're putting in an $800,000 pedestrian bridge over the Kalamazoo River. So we've had this road closed for 2 weeks. Also, our new subdivision is moving forward. They want to have their first homes available for May occupancy. In the end, it'll be about 200 homes. So that'll keep us busy here for that. The other thing we did is effective Monday morning, we closed City Hall to the public. We have an uptick here also, which I decided to close. We will have people can come in by appointment. We're also going to be talking here in the next couple of days of the health department's rule about you have to prove that you people working are essential. They can't be working from home. So that's going to be a discussion. I guess my OSHA inspectors are heading out Monday morning to go visit everybody to see if all your employees need to be in the building. So we're going to be talking about that here in the next couple of days. Anything else for the good of the group? Pam, what was the date excuse me, what was the date that we finally decided for our December board meeting?
I believe it's December 1st, Tom.
Okay. All right, 9 o'clock or 10 o'clock?
Oh, whatever you want.
Anybody preference of the board? I know that we did this one early because for the MCR. So Kevin, you're unmuted.
Oh, I have no problem. Whatever works. Sorry.
What
10
date
o'clock.
did you say in December? I'm sorry, I missed that. What first part? December 1st, was it?
Yes.
Thanks.
And thank you, everyone.
December 1st, 10 o'clock. Is that agreeable?
Yes.
Okay, good. All
Do we
right.
want to look at with all the stuff going on, do we want to look at a workshop date with all the stuff that you guys have thrown out there today?
Yeah, I would. I guess I'll throw out January. I don't know if we want to try to squeeze anything before Christmas. Does that sound maybe first part of January?
January sounds good to me.
Pam, could you send out a doodle or something just with some and anticipating the agenda, how many hours we would need.
Okay.
That will be another question we'll have to figure out is, how we do that work session too. Do we try to do electronic, which I think would be more difficult, but again, we won't know what it'll look like in 2 months from now. So, but throw some dates and then we'll try to figure out.
Okay.
Couple things, if you don't mind, not trying to complicate it, but some of the issues are important and they're time sensitive. If we do something electronically, maybe we break some of the subjects out and we have our December 1st meeting, maybe December 15th, the middle of the month, we just break down one of the items and talk about it. The cold water project, we might need to know more. I don't know, just a thought. Whatever works.
I think probably making a list of those subjects that we have, that we sent a lot of things to work session today. Maybe than anticipating. I know it's going to be a strange Christmas and holidays for all of us here. So, but okay. Anything else for the good of the group?
I have a general. Sorry, somebody was talking. I have a general question. Had anybody heard that if you have an employee who tests positive, that the employer is responsible for all the contact tracing? Has anybody heard that?
No. Chris, you're muted.
Oh, sorry, I was yelling to somebody else. I was listening to the question. I was asking if we had the answer to that. So
I've not heard it. I've heard that you have to report that to the various people who have come in contact that of, fellow employees, but you get a hold of the health department. So I've not heard it, but what do I know?
Yeah, I was just curious. We had another employer call us and say, hey, and they wouldn't give us any information and say somebody who worked for us was at your place and they were tested positive. But I never ever heard that. I now have to go around and call other businesses, which I can't really provide them any data. Thank you. I'm just looking. I just want to make sure I wasn't off base or if somebody else heard anything different. It could be, just
my assistant manager watched a thing from OSHA or something recently, and they did mention that that you'd have to make calls or do contact tracing or something to that effect. I thought she had said something about that, which I don't know anything more than that. I just know we had heard somewhat similar thing from it was Sean Egan who was talking on a webinar and I think he was with OSHA, but I don't know where that came from or if that's true or not. just rely on.
Yeah.
I think it's hard. I think it'd be hard to try to know where my employee went and, you know, maybe while he's on work time, but I don't know who he talked to. So been very strange. Thank you.
Eric, do you know, I mean, for us, you've been sort of the contact. Have you ever heard of that?
No, I haven't heard anything about calling outside parties. It was been more of internal. But I'm reading through the rules and everything right now, verifying an update on our plan. So,
yeah, I think it's been our county health department who's doing the contact tracing. You know, I know my son. When my son and grandson got it, they got a call every single day. And last I heard that our health department was making 800 to 900 phone calls a day of those people that were still within that 14-day period.
Well, I looked up where we had heard it. It was Michigan Department of Labor and Economic Opportunity. It was Sean Egan, and he's got some videos online there too. And that's where we had heard that. So that might be a good contact to ask. And it was that. So
Yeah, I figured you guys are in different health departments for the most part, and I think everybody's handling it a little different. We have not heard that down in France County that employers.
Yeah, I don't think we have a legal right to do it. I think the health department probably has the legal, but yeah, we just it's been interesting. I saw on the listserv where Saugatuck lost their entire DPW crew, and they're looking for someone to come up and pick up leaves. So I think everybody was just laughing on that one, but no, it's not. And if most of you knew, we lost our entire line crew for 10 plus days. So fortunately, the weather was good, and we just had some minor things happen that we're taking care of. You know, thank you to Coldwater. So on that note, everybody stay healthy. Enjoy your Thanksgiving, you know, with your families. And they say that's one of the ways it's going to get passed around again. So well, I guess we'll just all hang in there. So again, thank you to the board and AMP staff. So have a good Thanksgiving. We'll see you on December 1st.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Yeah.